It's just about 4 on my clock, so we're going to make a start now. I'm sure there'll be a few people that join us a little bit late, and that's fine. So for those of you that haven't joined one of the webinars so far, this is one in a series all around the Safer Patient Flow Bundle. Today, a couple of my colleagues, Tim and Erica, are going to walk us through the bundle, some aspects. There's going to be a bit of a clinical conversation with a few of the ECIST medics to talk you through their experiences of what they've done, the impact it can have, and hopefully some quite helpful tips for you. After the webinar, we'll share any resources that have been talked about, and we will share the recording of the webinar as well. If you haven't joined it yet, do have a look at the ECIST NHS Futures site. All of the recordings from all of the webinars are there, loads of great resources. But enough from me, I'll hand over to my colleague, Tim, now. I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Thanks, Spencer. Hello, everyone. My name's Tim Gillatt. I'm a Senior Improvement Manager with ECIST, and I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar today on the F of the Safer Patient Flow Bundle, which is around early pull. So this is around all wards who routinely receive patients from an assessment area receiving their first patient by 10 o'clock in the morning. And as Spencer said, this is part of a wider series of webinars around the Safer Patient Flow Bundle, and follows on nicely and from the senior review and all patients having a plan with an EDD, which we discussed in the previous 2 weeks. Why is this important then? So here's a tweet from Dr. Gordon Caldwell, who currently works up in Scotland, talking about scheduling discharges for early in the morning. So they schedule discharges for 9 a.m. so ward nurses can pull patients from AMU early in the day to start flow early. And this is really around kick-starting the day and kick-starting flow through the hospital and doing the right thing for our patients. It is possible. It's something that isn't consistently done in an awful lot of places, but certainly is something that makes a big difference to patients, to staff, and to the flow of the day in hospital. And as you can see here, what we're trying to do is move discharges forward earlier in the day. We'll discuss more detail of that next week when we talk about the E, which is around 33% of patients to be discharged being discharged by midday. That's slightly separate. We want to really focus on that first patient of the day moving to the ward by 10 a.m. today. So it's really about starting the day well and really getting today's work done early in the day and starting that movement of patients through the system to home early on in the day. And what we're going to talk about today is, why is early flow important? What difference does it make? How can we improve? Some practical ideas to work with. I'll be chairing the session, and I'm delighted to welcome Ben Owens, an ED consultant and clinical associate, who's going to talk a little bit about that, why the early flow is important. Ben does have to leave us after that, so Ben's only here for the next 10 minutes or so. But then we're going to move the conversation a bit onto the how we can improve that and give you some practical ideas to work with and have a conversation. So please do use the chat. Please do pop your hand up.
Tim's frozen there. I'm assuming you can hear me. If he's frozen, I can see nods.
Clinical associates.
We lost you there.
Sorry,
Tim.
I think I left there for a moment. I am back. And my colleague Erika McGinnes, who's also on screen, who is an improvement manager with the team, who's just come out of an ops role in an acute trust. But without any further ado, Ben, can I hand over to you to talk us through why early flow is important and the difference it can make to our patients and our systems?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I say I'm Ben Owens. I'm an ED consultant, as well as a clinical associate with ECIST. This is really, it's about how it's benefits for the staff, it's benefits for the patient who you're discharging home, and it's benefits for the patient you're bringing into your ward. And not only that, it's benefit to the patient who's waiting to get into that admission area. We know people arrive in the hospital. People tend to start to arrive in emergency departments by ambulance, certainly from sort of 10, 11 o'clock onwards. So you need capacity in your departments, and you'd hope the department was clear. So you want to get flow through, free your ED up to make sure flow is coming through for your patients in there. And if you always think, well, the test is always, if my relative was in ED, if my relative was in the admissions unit, my relative was on ward, what would I want for them? And actually, this is achievable. Most discharges aren't a complete surprise. So if we know it's likely to happen on a certain day, it's about teeing things up, and the guys will talk about how you do it a bit more. But actually, most ward rounds occur in the mornings on wards and should occur in the morning. The earlier the better. So actually, For the patients going home, if you identify who's likely to go home and see them first in the ward round, or even have nurse-led discharge, whatever process you've got there, getting that person out, it's best for them. They get to go home early. They get to go and see their family. If they're older and more frail, they get to go into their house in the daytime when there's more support around, when people are more likely to be able to help them. And so it's better for your patient going home. They're going at a time of day when there's time. If they are going home to when you're sorting out, they've got time to do it versus later in the day when it may be more difficult. And we know sometimes even discharges don't happen because they're so late in the day, something's not in place, or they miss something. So it's really important for that person to get them out. It's important for the patient coming into your ward, because actually, if the patient arrives in your ward by 10 o'clock in the morning, hopefully your ward round is still going on. So your ward round is still going on, and your new patient arrives who'll benefit from your expertise in your speciality, whatever your speciality is. And actually, they get to see the consultant, the registrar, the nurse, the senior nursing team who are on the daytime, or they can turn up at 5 at night when the doctors and nurses have gone, when you've got sort of out of hours hospital cover, when you've got your ward leader may have gone home or whatever else. So if you have as a patient coming into your ward, I want to come into your ward in the daytime when the ward round is still going on. So actually they're seen on the ward round by the consultant and senior nursing team, so they get the best care plan in place that they can do. And that will only happen if they get there in the morning when the ward round is going on. So massively beneficial for that patient. And better for the staff on the ward, because actually the staff on the ward get the patients when they've got lots of staff around, when they've got that senior support. If the patient's not too sick, that's great. If they are sick, well, you've got a lot more staff around. They come late in the day or the evening and there's fewer staff around, it's a lot harder to deal for them. So it's better for the one patient going home. It's better for the patient who's coming in. It's better for the staff on the ward because they get the patients when they've got a lot of support around, and they'll probably get a plan made for that patient that they're going to care for by a senior clinician on the day they come in, rather than the following day if they came up later in the day. But it's also better for the patients on the admissions unit in ED, because actually then the bed is free, and it always takes an hour or so to sort the bed out, or infection control reason, whatever. So actually you're making the bed free in the admissions unit for the first GP arrivals, for the first ED arrivals to come through. So actually it's better for everyone to do this. It does require a bit of organisation. The guys will talk about that. But that in many ways, it's better for everyone involved to do that. Sometimes there are ways of doing it that people feel uncomfortable with. So there are ways to do it. So things like, well, that patient may sit out, or that patient may go to the discharge lounge before their TCO is written, or which is not ideal, but may need to be done. And that's where we come more into the balancing risks here. So if the hospital is in escalation, when there is a real push for beds and push for patients, that actually we need to balance the risks here. How do we get this patient home? What can we do? How do we think differently to get that done? And you might do things in that scenario that you may not do on a normal day, but that's the right thing for patients to get that one out, to get the next one in. And actually most hospitals will work. Most hospitals have enough beds ultimately. They just come too late in the day. They appear, or they appear on the wall, but then the patient moved from the admissions unit might take 2 hours to get there, which means the bed in the admissions unit comes 2 hours later, and it all backs up quite quickly. But one patient for your ward may not seem a lot. If your hospital has 20 wards and 20 wards take a patient by 10 a.m., that's a massive impact. That's 10 empty beds on your admission unit. That's a massive impact. That's half your admissions unit for many places, empty or being empty, ready for the take coming in the day. And we also know that staff, when they are not crammed, when they're not rushed, make better decisions. And actually we know from emergency departments that the less crowded you are, the lower the length of stay is, you actually often have a lower admission rate as well, because people are less pressured and they have more time to think. So it's better for everyone through the whole system going forward to get people through in a timely fashion. But mostly for the ward staff, it's better for your patients going, but your patient that's coming in, and they're your patient before they've got to you, because they're going to benefit from your expertise. They come to your ward because you are the experts in your field, your specialty. And the other thing probably is that a lot of trusts will come and think, if you get your first patient by 10, you get to pick which one you get. And sometimes you get one that's most relevant for your specialty, rather than a patient that is a general medicine, general surgical, whatever patient that might not be an ideal fit for your ward. And we have to take them on occasions because the beds are what they are. But if you go down and work with your admissions unit, you pick and pull the patients that really need your help the most. So that's better for you and your patients as well. So hopefully there are so many benefits in doing this, and it is doable. It's about how we align everything to do it. But thank you very much for listening. Anything else you need from me, Tim, or any questions? I've got a couple of minutes. I have to dash, I'm afraid.
That's no problem, Ben. Thank you for that. I think the point you make there around everyone gets a bed eventually is really, really crucial, isn't it? You know, we're talking, I'm into site meetings, we'll come back to site management at some point on this call, I'm sure. You know, and we can in the morning be -50, -60 beds, depending on the scale of the size of the organisation. That can seem really, really scary, can't it? But people who work in those systems always have confidence that that all will come good. But you're right. I think it's about that bringing everything forward earlier in the day, isn't it? And making things happen there. And obviously, the point you make around crowding in ED is really crucial, isn't it? In terms of mortality and patient outcomes as well. And I think the ideal state is that steady flow out and onto the wards is great for ED in terms of not being an assessment units, in terms of not being given 10 beds all at once at 4 o'clock or at a protected meal time, for example, later in the day. And equally, as a receiving ward, speaking as a former nurse, to get that to not have 4 or 5 patients all arriving in ward at the same time is A, great operationally and clinically, but B, the safest way to the safest way to do this, isn't it? I think we've all come across those challenges, haven't we, of arriving in the morning at work and finding that there is a number of patients from overnight requiring beds in ED. And we talk about this in ECIST quite a lot now. As a marker of outcomes and in effect how good your day is going to be. If you've got patients in ED in the morning, what does that feel like Ben, as an ED consultant?
Yeah,
it's waiting with people waiting for beds from overnight.
Yeah, I think it's demoralising for staff. I think it's the patients. If ED is an environment for assessing people and making a decision. It's not an environment to stay in. And I think, with all the best will in the world and putting them on beds in ED, and it's not the right environment for people. It's a noisy environment. You've got frail old people often waiting for beds next to drunks and aggressive mental health patients or aggressive patients or confused patients who are there, and they're all in the same environment, which you don't get in a ward. The reason we put people in wards in beds for a reason. It's the right environment for them. So it's frustrating for the staff and demoralising, but actually it's the patients I think the most of. And I think the way to always look at this is the patient going home is the most well patient in the system. The people coming in through the front door, the people coming off the admissions unit into your beds are the ones who are most needing of the care we can give. So it's most important we get them into the beds as fast as we can in doing so. And the most well patient, the one going home, comes out of the system. And the question I'd always ask people, and I say this to my colleagues in ED, my juniors in ED, when they're working, imagine your relative is at the back of that queue. Just walk, and you cannot see them first. You have to go through this queue. How would you choose to work? And that follows through the system. So for the admissions unit, imagine your relative's just arrived in ED, the ward staff. Imagine your relative's just pitched up an ED or is an ambulance waiting to be picked up from outside ED out in the community. What would you do on your ward or in your admission area or in your ED to make sure that patient got seen as quickly as possible? And if everyone did that through the whole system, what a fabulous service we provide. And we can do that. It's just about seeing that picture and thinking, how do I get that patient on my ward as fast as possible for that patient and the others? I think it's a really powerful thing we can do. And the one patient for your ward is the cumulative effect of that for the hospital that makes the difference for every ward.
Absolutely. I mean, thanks so much, Ben. Thanks for taking the time to join us this afternoon and making that case so eloquently. I think that the great example of that people can look at is Matthew's story, which is fundamentally the patient most at risk in the system is the one at home having dialed 999, waiting for attention from the emergency services. And obviously we can signpost people to that in terms of making that compelling clear case. But thanks so much for making the case for us there, Ben, around the difference that we can make to patients and to system safety through using the F of safer and moving patients earlier in the day. And good luck on your next meeting. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks.
No problem at all. I want to bring Dan and Erika in now, and we want to move on to talk about. So we've made the case for why this is important. And I think everybody can buy into that. I don't think there's anything there that's particularly contentious that moving patients early in the day is a good thing. But how do we do this? And I think there are two elements to this that I want to cover particularly, which is the clinical element. So what can clinical teams, Dan, do to support this? And then operationally as well, how can an ops team support this? Because it's got to be a joint effort, this, hasn't it, to make this come alive and become a regular part of working in a hospital. So Dan, have you got some early thoughts around some of the practicalities?
Yeah, most definitely. And thanks, Tim, for the invite to come and speak today. And before I move on to my own thoughts, I just need to echo what Ben said. I've had the great pleasure, in inverted commas, of working with Dr. Owens for the last 4 or 5 years of my junior doctor training. And he does live what he preaches in these sessions, actually, about kind of valuing every patient's time in A&E. And that's fed through to the results that Sherwood Forest have in terms of their targets and their flow in their hospital. So it's having that senior clinical leader leading as they preach is really valuable, actually. I think that's my first message, really, is having those clinical leaders who are visible on the shop floor and every day, sometimes monotonously, kind of repeating the same message, so everybody has got the same drive towards improving quality of care for patients. So that's my first message. But I think the second one is, I'm a respiratory doctor, so my work is 2 steps back from A&E. It's after the acute medical unit, or it's sometimes in the acute medical unit, but on the wards. And I think the first thing is just, what's your battle rhythm of your day? What's your ward day look like? And I think some of the things that Ben said really echoes with me. If you don't see a patient today, you allow them to sit in acute medicine, then come to your ward at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You're not doing less work, you're just delaying that amount of work until tomorrow. And so it's about the kind of doing the right amount of work at the right time. So I would preach, again, like they do at Sherwood Forest hospitals and a lot of other trusts that we visit with ECIST, having a really sustainable and efficient in-reach service from specials into acute medicine. So those patients who are in acute medicine are actually gaining a specialty opinion even when they're in acute medicine. And that allows you to, as Ben was saying, to almost choose the patients that come up to your unit. One of the reasons for doing that is it gives clinicians that autonomy about who is coming up to their wards and allows them to work with the ops team rather than working against them. And so I think, before I move on to the things, having a good in-reach system and having that battle rhythm where it fits within your ward and your ward rounds is really important.
I think that's really important, Dan, just to pick up on that. A lot of, in my experience as well, working with systems around urgent emergency care, a lot of this is about relationships, isn't it? And understanding each other's worlds, understanding the pressures that each other are under. So that relationship between acute medicine and the wards, for example, and acute medicine and ED, they're absolutely crucial building blocks, aren't they, to understanding each other's worlds and where our patients are in the process.
Yeah, we did a fantastic project. This is dating about 3 or 4 years ago now, where at Sherwood Forest hospitals, we struggled to get our patients with non-invasive ventilation into a bed efficiently. And that was about ring fencing in beds and understanding from both a flow team and a clinical team the importance of early treatment for these patients with type 2 respiratory failure. And it was about understanding each other's world and each other's pressures and priorities. And it's really easy as the clinician, and I don't mean this in any insulting way to colleagues at all, to feel helpless in bed management, because it's not our direct responsibility. And sometimes I don't think everybody understands their role within the system in terms of discharges. So when you actually start to understand your own data in terms of, for example, at Sherwood Forest hospitals, we only had a bed available for these patients, non-invasive ventilation, about 30 to 40% of the time before we started doing some quality improvement work on it. When you look at that data and realise that the quality of your care is inversely impacted, and you go and talk to bed managers, you go and talk to ED and critical care especially, you realise how everyone sharing these challenges makes it a lot easier. And we, doing quality improvement initiatives, got that up to 70, 80% of the time we had a bed available. And that was because we decided as clinicians, working with the discharge teams and working with the site managers, that we would kind of have autonomy over our own processes. And part of that was getting people out of the unit that much earlier to try and create beds and capacity.
I think, and again, that's a really valid point, isn't it? Bringing the site management team or the bed management team, whatever you want to call them, into this conversation. And that's an area where the ECIST is expanding its work in. At the moment, I'd like to bring Erika in on that, really, because the site management teams and their responsibility for flow isn't exclusively theirs, is it? We always used to say back in the day that the site team can only administer the capacity that they're given. They don't admit or discharge patients, do they? So they do have to work hand in glove with the clinical teams and the ward teams, don't they, to make that work. Erika, have you got experience of that in terms of the way that ops and clinical teams have to work together to make early flow work?
I think as I was doing my preparation for the session, I came across the phrase flow as a team sport, and never really has it emphasised how important that is. The flow team are absolutely at the behest of our operational teams on a daily basis to make things happen. So my expectations as an operational manager was for the flow team to help bring bits and pieces together. But clearly, in order to do that successfully, they need the ward teams on board, they need the clinical teams on board, and one thing kind of needs to hand off very seamlessly to the other. So for me, that ward level engagement is absolutely paramount, and within that, it's staff understanding their responsibility in the process, absolutely fundamental. And I think Ben touched on it before. We're asking for one patient from every ward, and I think the more you break down that task and the more you break down that responsibility, the more achievable it becomes, because people can then identify what it is that we are asking them to kind of help support and deliver. So I think the more of that we do, the easier it is to kind of start to put the building blocks together as well.
That's a really good point. And I guess for this, what you're both saying really is that actually for that first patient move of the day, it's the site team can kind of get out of the way of that really. If the wards are committed to taking that patient, they're creating the capacity to take that, the relationship should, for that first discharge, should be directly between the ward and acute medicine, Dan?
Most definitely. And I think going back to my initial point of kind of the battle rhythm for the day, it's how many hospitals do we visit, Tim and Erika, as part of ECIST, where the clinical team start time and the site ops kind of team start time are different. And so we still in medicine still have this historical start time of 9 o'clock in the morning very often, whereas we all know that the site gets going kind of 7 o'clock in the morning after nurse handover, 8 o'clock in the morning. And so actually some of this is, again, the autonomy of the clinicians to kind of understand where they fit into the day-to-day kind of rhythm of the day. And it might be that some of that is a slightly earlier start time, so those decisions are made earlier. But if that's not possible due to job plan and stuff, some of that is about the work that you've done the day before. So it's this, when you're going home in the evening as junior doctors, or you're supporting your junior doctors as a senior doctor on, let's say, an afternoon catch-up, can you identify those golden patients? Can you identify patients that might be going to go home with a nurse-led discharge or criteria-led discharge? So I say it's sometimes very easy to think that some of these things are just outside of our control, but I think there's lots of little techniques that we can kind of encourage people to do to pick these things up.
Let's talk a bit more then about the golden patient that you just picked up there, Dan, because that sounds like it makes sense. And clearly, this isn't about keeping today's discharge for tomorrow. So you hit a target, won't miss the point. This is about identifying a patient who will be ready to go early the next day. So how do you tell us a bit more about that, Dan, in your clinical experience of that, and how you work that patient up, one of a better phrase, to go first thing.
Yes, so I think golden patients and criteria-led or nurse-led patients discharges go hand in hand. I think to be honest, they're often the same thing. But also as a senior doctor, you do end up, when you write job plans for patients, you try and make them foolproof, so that a junior doctor from someone who's just finishing medical school up to kind of the day before being a consultant is able to kind of enact that plan. So whenever I do this, I'll give you an example of an asthma patient. With our asthma patients, we pretty much always keep an eye on them overnight after they've stopped their nebulizers. So it's relatively simple for me to write in a job plan at 2 o'clock in the afternoon for one of my asthmatic patients that I know well, home tomorrow if not needed a nebulizer overnight, and peak flow is 66% of normal. That doesn't need a doctor to come and check those pieces of information. That could be a nurse, especially that these patients should be seen by a specialty asthma nurse before discharge. So that's a really simple plan. It's the same plan that we have for pretty much every asthmatic in the whole of the hospital. So it doesn't really particularly even need a consultant respiratory clinician to document that plan. It could be, as I say, a respiratory specialist nurse or a junior doctor, ACP, that's got experience of working in those systems. In respiratory, we've got 3 or 4 kind of examples that I can give you of different conditions that have a set discharge criteria. But gastroenterology, cardiology, geriatrics, everyone will have similar criteria for their discharge. So it's kind of all about doing today's work today on a Tuesday afternoon. What day are we on today, Tim? Wednesday. On a Wednesday afternoon, there's no reason today for me not to make that plan, for our junior doctors not to do the discharge summary. So at 9 o'clock in the morning, after that patient's had a good night's sleep, hopefully not needing any nebulizers, they can be pretty much independent and go home on their own. The amount of hospitals where we see that they wait until 11 o'clock in the morning for their consultant to wave them goodbye, I think that those things we just don't need to do.
And that increased certainty, I guess, Erika, is really good for patients as well, isn't it? Because in terms of transport, in terms of getting settled in, the group of patients that you're talking about, there's growing empirical evidence that going home earlier in the day with in a more planned, programmed way leads to a successful discharge. They can get the services in. They can get a pint of milk, a loaf of bread, all that kind of stuff. The loved ones know when to expect them or when to come and collect them. It seems like it's a winner for everyone. But there must be there's clearly barriers to that, because it sounds a little motherhood and apple pie, doesn't it? In terms of stating the obvious. Why do we struggle with it, Dan?
Do you know why I think we struggle with it, Tim? Is because of anecdotes. So you can do this 100 times and you'll be successful 9 times out of 10. But it's those 10 patients where you've made a plan overnight and the patient and it happens to every patient, understand sometimes, that they become more unwell overnight. And I think and this is about a balance of risk. And I don't think there's no change to the risk of the patient, but it's our appreciation of the risk. Is that, so 1 time in 10 we'll make this plan and that plan will not come off. But we know that. We prescribe IV antibiotics and know that every so often we'll have to escalate them to a different type of antibiotic. That doesn't stop us prescribing the initial antibiotic. We don't all jump to the £20,000 antibiotic that's held in microbiology under a lock and key. We still follow protocol, but we know every so often it won't work. But these kind of simple plans, I think what happens to us is we get understandably kind of fearful maybe that our plan hasn't been enacted. And so instead of acting on the 9 out of 10 that it all works well, we kind of, and I don't think it's overreacting, but we remember the ones that haven't worked well. So I think that's why we don't do it from my point of view as frequently as we should.
I think perseverance is also key here. So taking a leaf from what Dan's just said, I think my experience sometimes of the golden patient is that we do it because it feels fashionable and it feels like the right thing to do, but we perhaps give up on it all too quickly. And I think it works well when it becomes embedded in the fabric of the organisation and business as usual and kind of part and parcel of daily life. In terms of that battle rhythm that we kind of spoke about before, and the more we can kind of work hard and together as a team to make that kind of our daily ops, regardless of how challenging situations are, then I guess the more of a chance we have of making that happen. I guess, Tim, what we also can't forget about is that COVID has put a little bit of pressure in terms of how we may choose to flow patients, and in the past we would have perhaps agreed to sit patients out. The reality of sitting a patient out now is probably a little bit more complicated than it used to be before. So I guess, there's other infrastructure in the hospital, whether it's a discharge lounge, planning early the night before for that early discharge to make sure that you've lined absolutely everything up. But I guess it would be amiss perhaps to not inject that realism into our conversation today and not acknowledge that COVID has certainly put a little bit of pressure on flow.
Erika makes a really good point about embedding these changes. And I think what we have seen, and I've done this myself, and I know there's people on the call that I've worked with clinically as well, is that if you try and do these things in isolation, it's very difficult for them to come off, because you might be the only clinician on a ward with 3 consultants and 5 registrars and junior doctors all working in slightly different ways. These things need to be embedded in how your ward and how your trust works. Because otherwise, what is the expectation if you're a patient? Generally, it's that you'll see a doctor before you leave. And so often that's the morning or the afternoon that you leave hospital. There's no reason why that can't be the day before, but often it's the day of you leave. So we need to set expectations for patients and staff as well. And that's about embedding these processes really clearly in the day-to-day battle with them with your ward.
Brilliant, thank you. And I want to come back, you both touched on discharge lounges there, and I do want to come back to them because I think they're a really interesting topic and we'll spend a bit of time talking about it. But before we do, Dan, so hopefully we have got the golden patient. If we haven't, and like you say, you've got a board round and a ward round typically starting at 9 o'clock. Is it still possible there to facilitate an early move for a patient on a full ward? How would you prioritise? Now, we've talked about this a lot. Richard was on the call, and we talked about this in the S and the A in previous weeks. But in your experience, can you still generate an early discharge without a golden patient identified the night before?
I don't see why not. And I think the thing is, it's about how efficient your morning board round is, and it's about your prioritisation after that board round of how you go and assess patients. So, for example, if you've got a good in-reach system into acute medicine, your specialty, from my point of view, respiratory, should have already seen the vast majority of your patients that come up to your ward, unless it's an overnight patient. So the patient should have plans in place that you just need to kind of carry out. So you have your board round. Let's say you've got a ward of 30 patients. That should take you no more than 15 or 20 minutes. And if you prioritise the sick ones and then the ones that are going to go home using that shop model, there's no reason why patients can't go home efficiently and quickly, especially if you utilise things like Discharge Lounge. The other thing is, and this is becoming more commonplace, but a few years ago was pretty difficult to say, not every patient needs a consultant or a senior review, especially if they've had a senior review early on in their admission, and again, you're just following through plans. We've gone through swings and roundabouts with this, that a few years ago, every patient almost every day needed a consultant review. But the difficulty with that is that it impacts on training, it's not that efficient. Junior doctors never get to make their own decisions and kind of, again, determine their own kind of risk benefits and risk register. So I think it's identifying the patients quickly who need a senior review, identifying the patients who could be maybe seen by a specialty COPD nurse or asthma nurse, and then quickly identifying which patients could safely move to a place like Discharge Lounge, or, as Erika said, this is more difficult recovery, but sit out and go to the day room for an hour waiting for their medication.
Brilliant. Let's move on to the Discharge Lounge then, and then we'll move back to AMU and pulling that patient, because that seems like a really good, sensible idea. Discharge lounges, I think it's fair to say there's mixed evidence as to whether discharge lounges work. I mean, there's not a great body of literature that says they do, but instinctively, there's a feel that they could, and we've been doing work with a number of systems recently. Certainly Lincoln, I see Wendy Holt on the call, and we've done some work with Lincoln with the Midlands regional team around trying to pull discharges earlier in the day, which has seen, certainly over a reasonable period, some increased use of the discharge lounge. But things like patient satisfaction with the experience and patient experience of discharge lounges, I would say, is mixed to say the least. What's been your experience of discharge lounges, and are they worth persevering with? And if so, what would be your tips on getting the best out of your discharge lounge?
So I think the answer to that, Tim, is variable and dependent. For me, the most important thing for the discharge lounge is that it needs a real clear sense of identity. What is it and what are you going to use it for? So some discharge lounges just have seating facilities, others have a bit of both, mixture of kind of bedded and kind of seating facilities. The push versus pull model, I think, for me is critical. So how is the discharge lounge going to populate itself first thing on a morning? And you probably need a bit of both. I don't think it can be just one or the other, but I think all organizations would want to be clear on that model. And then in describing the function of the discharge lounge, will you provide it with support for TTOs to be completed on there if required? Because from experience, when we chose not to do that, because it's probably the right thing to do to get the TTO completed on the ward, that delayed our ability to kind of move the patient further downstream to create that early capacity. And this, I would say the same with transport. So for me, that kind of clear sense of identity is absolutely important. And then if it has bedded capacity, it's being really clear and careful to manage that bedded capacity so that it doesn't become an extension of a ward where you then require medical inmates to be provided to the patients in order to provide a safe level of care. So in essence, I think they can work, but I also think they take an element of kind of micromanaging in order to kind of deliver that successful outcome.
Yeah, I would agree exactly with what Erika just said. I think as Ben Owens said earlier, is that every patient gets a bed eventually. But if you open discharge lounge up I've never seen one open kind of later than 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night generally. But it just gives you that little bit of flexibility for when you're doing kind of pass the parcel or musical chairs. It gives you that little bit of flexibility. So inherently, it feels like they should be successful, even though, as you said, Tim, I've not seen much kind of trial evidence from them to say that they were. I think one thing we have to consider is that it is a transfer of patient's care. It's not just a place that you sit a patient waiting for an ambulance to come and collect them. So some of the really good examples I've seen, and Erika's right about making sure they have an identity, is where they actually add benefit to the patient's care. So, for example, for every patient with COPD, they should have a discharge bundle done for that patient. That's 20 minutes spent with the patient, enabling them to have their inhaler review checked to make sure they know how to use an inhaler, making sure they know what their medication is when they have another exacerbation of their COPD. I'm a respiratory doctor, so I'm forgetting the bundles of one of my core part of my job. But anyway, so they should have these kind of checklists done, and generally that's done by things like a specialty COPD nurse. There's no reason why that has to be done on a ward, but it's a really nice environment in discharge lounge to have those things done, because sometimes it's a little bit less clinical. You can do it over a cup of tea, so it's a bit more kind of friendly and holistic. But also we've seen when we went down to East Hertfordshire only a couple of weeks ago to their ward, and they do things like they deliver the last dose of antibiotics intravenously before patients go home. So they're not just waiting areas, they're actually delivering patient care. And I think it's a balance to achieve, because as Erika says, if you deliver too much care, you end up having to have medic oversights and stuff for these patients. But I think that's why you need to micromanage them and really determine what pathways of patients you're putting through the discharge lounges.
I think that's really important. The only thing I'd add, I think, Erika, you touched on the pull model in the discharge lounge, potentially pulling patients and going to the wards to take a patient. There's probably an information flow issue there, isn't there? If wards are identifying a golden discharge this afternoon, if that information flows well to the discharge lounge team first thing in the morning, then they can go and collect those patients, can't they? And take on a degree of that work on behalf of the wards, which I'm sure would be well received and welcomed by the ward teams, because they're helping out, aren't they, helping the ward teams to achieve what they need to achieve. I think the other thing in my experience on them is they often get used if they do have beds in at times of escalation, they can be used or they can be closed so their nurses go into the numbers on wards, for example. And I think while that operational pressure needs to be managed clearly, I think that can sometimes undermine the function, can't it, and put it perhaps too low down in the pecking order of priority for the hospital and the operational management. So I think that's something to consider too. So let's say we've had a golden patient, or we've identified a patient early on the ward round that morning, and we've managed to get capacity to be able to take a patient by 10 o'clock. You talked earlier, Dan, about, and we've seen it in various places about, and Ben mentioned it as well, about ward teams going and choosing a patient from acute medicine. How does that work, and what's the benefit of that?
So I'll go turn it around slightly, Tim, and say, why would we not do it? And if you've got a patient in acute medicine that's waiting for, let's say, for a gastroenterology review of a patient, that patient is having poorer care than the patient on your wards, because the patients on your wards have got specialty nurse reviews. They might have, say, nurses and doctors with hundreds of years of experience between them looking after them. But on acute medicine, although that care is fantastic, it's not the specialty care that patient needs. So, as I said earlier, by identifying patients who should be coming to the ward and pulling them to your ward earlier, they get potentially an extra day's worth of quality care, or a day earlier quality care and specialty care from your system. So how do we do it? I say you need to have potentially an in-reach into your acute medical unit. It's also about good IT and handover and making sure that people can identify who these patients are. I'll give you a really good example where this works fantastically, and it's a good example of multidisciplinary team working as well. In Derby, they start their working day in acute medicine 8 o'clock in the morning. The specialty doctors go round and see people within their acute medicine. That allows acute medical doctors to do what they're very good at, and that's not to look after things like COPD patients or for GI bleeds. It's to look after same-day emergency care patients. So it releases their acute medical doctors to go do more ambulatory care and work like that. The doctors go down with a specialty nurse or an ACP, and therefore there is continuity of care from the Derby acute medical unit up to the wards, because that ACP or specialty nurse goes back to the ward, has a chat with the nurse in charge and says, Mr. Jones on acute medicine, he's our next patient to pull because he's the sickest, please can we pull him up to the ward? So it allows continuity of care, it allows kind of sensible handover between patients. And I say also the benefit of doing this is that it allows acute medicine to do what they do best, which is turn patients around, same day emergency care, ambulatory care.
And I think the other benefit for patients is you're more likely to get onto the right ward. So you're more likely to get onto a respiratory ward takes a respiratory patient. They choose a respiratory patient, don't they? The gastro ward chooses a gastroenterology patient, which kind of breaks some of that cycle of allocation by the site teams, which can sometimes be the next available bed, which is understandable given the pressures, but again doesn't necessarily lead to the best patient outcomes, leads to more patient moves. Every time a patient moves, it adds to length of stay, doesn't it?
It does. And if you're having these conversations at 9 o'clock in the morning, you have a chance to have a conversation about it and actually pick people on clinical need. If you're having this conversation at 5 o'clock in the evening, it's no wonder that clinical need is not always your first priority, because
absolutely.
Because you have the pressures of the fact that A&E is getting busy, that you're starting to bed people down in ED, that acute medicine is getting pressured. So it's all about having these decisions as early and as sensibly as possible.
Absolutely. So Erika, let me play out. So Dan's just said 9 o'clock. So if a patient is identified at 9 o'clock to move to an empty bed on Dan's respiratory ward, Dan's identified the patient on AMU, the bed is empty at 9 o'clock, how quickly should the patient move to that bed?
How long is a piece of string, I guess. It's not like the easiest of processes, I think, as we all know. It's not a complex process, but you're drawing on so many different resources. So I would conservatively want to say within the hour, and I'm saying within the hour because it also reflects our clinically ready to proceed measure, which is now going to be one of the bundles in the emergency care data set that will kind of be monitored. But the reality of that hour is that you need to call a porter, the bed needs to be cleaned, you need to make sure that the other patient has left the ward. So I'm not underestimating the challenge that our kind of clinical and ward teams have in actually making that happen in the context of what is always going to be a busy ward environment, which is sometimes realistically also going to be understaffed. So that preparation for me, the earlier the better, is key. And again, in my kind of reading, somebody said to me, you know, you have to slow down to speed up, and how important is that? And that kind of taking a little bit of time to reflect, making sure that the team first thing on the morning has collectively agreed who that patient is, so that everybody is using their kind of collective resource availability for that kind of common purpose and common objective.
But it's a vicious cycle, isn't it, Erika? Because we're talking earlier about the fact that we want every specialty ward to have a golden patient ready for 10 o'clock in the morning. So by definition, acute medicine should have a patient ready to leave by 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. But they don't get patients ready for that because they know that inherently they don't have that bed available. Yeah. So we're talking about the fact that, yes, you need to book porters and your nurses need to get the patient ready and all those kind of things. There's no reason why, if you had a bed available, that those things could just not be inherently planned every single morning. So you had a porter ready at 10 o'clock in the morning, but we don't do that. So actually what we end up doing is ringing a porter, which adds an extra job to every nurse's ring. If we had this system working well, we would just have a porter sat there waiting, because at 10 o'clock in the morning, they knew every day a patient was flowing.
I think it goes back to what I said earlier in the context of it needs to be part of the fabric of what we do as an organisation on a daily basis. And the more it kind of becomes ingrained in our kind of daily life cycles, then you're absolutely right, Dan. It kind of becomes something that everybody expects to happen by default rather than maybe wait to see if it will happen.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm just going to talk for a moment about metrics and how we measure improvement in this, and give a couple of examples. I'll come to you for some as well. But a 2-minute warning to colleagues on the call. So there's a number of clinicians on the call I can see, and a number of ECIST clinicians. If anybody has any other top tips they'd want to add, or any other questions before we close, then make a note now or pop your hand up. That would be fabulous. But obviously, in all improvement work, and this is a real. The Safer Patient Flow Bundle is a real improvement tool. It's not about performance management. It's about getting better and improving what we do. We need to be able to measure that, don't we, to see if there's been any improvement. So we often talk about things like how you're doing boards, don't we? So ward teams know what they're doing. So if this is a priority for a ward team, we need to be looking at measuring that, don't we, and giving that information back to the team. So the number of, did we today achieve this? Did we, are we doing it on a run chart, etc., etc. And also the other measure that I think could be helpful with this is measuring flow from AMU. So perhaps measuring the bed position on your AMU and 10 o'clock might be the time to do that, might it? To say, are we in a positive bed state, as in empty beds and nobody to come in, or a negative bed state? I think, as I touched on earlier, as a hardened ops person, I think there's definitely correlation, if not causation, between coming in the morning and knowing that you've got empty beds on acute medicine, and how the day will be from a flow and a performance, and whether you have a good day or not, shall we say. If you come in the days, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, when you're coming in, there were perhaps 5 empty beds with nobody to come in on acute medicine, you knew the day was probably going to be okay. But if you came into a full AMU with perhaps 5 or 10 patients in ED waiting for a bed, you knew you were starting the day on the back foot, for want of a better phrase. So I think that's possibly a good metric to think about as well. Any other thoughts of how you can know what you're doing with this, and how we can improve our processes?
To me, this as a clinician, Tim, this goes back to, I want to collect the data once and not have to kind of do manual data entry and things like that. So this goes back to in most trusts now it's the IT. And how many trusts does anyone ever seen when they've gone around or where we're working, where there's 3, 4, 5, 6 versions of the truth floating around in different people's handover sheets? How many trusts intrinsically don't trust their EPR, their nerve center, their handover system for board round and things like that? So yes, I completely agree with your 2 ideas of metrics. I think there's almost one step back there from a clinician point of view is, can we get those handovers on that utilize IT? Can we get patient transfers IT to be accurate so that the metrics that they create, we all trust inherently? Again, I won't name the trust, but I went to a really good trust a couple of weeks ago with Vince, and they had a fantastic board round. They have a digital handover software, which, to be honest, only the nurse in the room had access to. Not everyone had a password, but only the nurse had a device to access it. So this digital software is being unused. I went to talk to the nurse for half an hour after the ward round. Within 30 minutes, she had 3 phone calls from 3 different teams asking her what a bed state was. So in that room, I counted 7 different handover documents. And after that room, after the board round, there was 3 phone calls asking her the bed state because no one intrinsically trusted the digital system. So the amount of improvement I think is positive and possible through the digital handover, and therefore your metrics that you get hopefully can be calculated quite easily and automatically, so busy doctors and nurses don't need to do it, and it can be visible. It can be there every morning when you turn on the system to do your board round.
I think my only kind of addition to that is to try to keep things as simple as possible. There will be other kind of measures that organizations keep an eye on a daily basis, ED crowding being one of them, general kind of flow out of the emergency departments, which could be also used as proxy measures, maybe not at ward level clearly, and I appreciate the importance of wards knowing how they're doing at individual level. But there will be measures that actually, if there is that collective kind of contribution to flow, that will start to evidence very quickly that things are moving in the right direction.
But choose a metric that the clinicians agree with. It doesn't have to be, well, I say agree with, that's maybe the wrong word, but co-develop a metric that clinicians recognise. If it's a metric like crowding, unless you're an ED doctor, a lot of people, unless they have an intrinsic interest in flow, and people like myself and Baraf and the other clinician Jyoti on the call, we're probably in the minority actually to have a special interest in things like flow. So develop a metric which is instantly understandable. Something as Tim, you described earlier, do you have a bed empty? Really simplistic. It could be a yes or no as well. It doesn't even have to be a numerical number, but choose a metric that people intrinsically recognise and they realise why it's beneficial to patients.
That's a fair point, Dan.
Brilliant. Dan, Erika, thanks so much for your contributions there. I think that's been a fascinating conversation. I'm just going to give a minute just to see if anybody on the call has got any further comments they'd like to add or any questions before we close. So do put your hand up if there's anything anybody would want to add or to ask. I'll give a few seconds for that before we close.
Stunned silence, Tim.
You've covered it all, guys. You've covered it all. Thanks so much. We'll leave it there. Spencer, I'll pass back to you to close, and thank you to everybody for joining today. Victoria's just put a comment in about golden patients. Let me just have a look. But it makes total
very
sense.
Similar to the surgical initiative, Victoria. Exactly. So the ethos and the spirit is exactly the same, and Victoria, equally the work.
Yeah, Victoria, I know we've been in contact via email. If you want to drop me a line, I'd be more than happy to have a conversation about the things that we've discussed here further, if we want to book some time for us to do that. But thanks so much for your time, everyone. Thanks for joining. And Spencer, I'll pass back to you to close.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. And again, thanks to Erika, Dan, everyone that's contributed today. I hope you've all found it really interesting. I hope you've taken some little tips and snippets you can take back to your various trusts. So as with every webinar that we're running at the moment, we'll send round the recording of this tomorrow, but either tomorrow or the next day, depending on how quickly we can edit it down. We'll upload it on YouTube. We'll stick it on the Futures site. And like I said, if you haven't joined the ECIST Futures platform yet, do check it out. It's really, really good. Loads of good information there. For those of you that have joined a few, or those of you that have just joined today and thought it was all right, actually, we're running another 2 after this. So every week, every Wednesday, 4 to 5, we've got 2 left to do. Next week, we'll be talking about early discharge. So how do you get around a third of your patients discharged by midday? So again, we'll be talking to some of our clinicians about how they do it, how they structure their day. We'll give you some improvement tips, and we'll talk you through some other really practical things you can do to help improve your flow earlier in the day. If you're here already, you don't need to register again. You can use the same link you used today to join next week. So we hope that you found it helpful. We hope that a lot of you will join us again next Wednesday. And a final thank you from me to all of our presenters and everyone that's joined to listen. I hope you've enjoyed it. Have a nice evening, and we'll see you again next week.